right. Okay, so starting a new unit today, Unit C, learning and cognition. So we're talking about basically it'll be three lectures. So we talk about the foundations of learning and memory today, and then we'll talk about sort of looking for learning in complex behaviors and analyze sort of examples of that. Then on Tuesday, and then we'll introduce cognition and its relevance to the study of animal behavior on Thursday, and then that'll be that. So there is still the ARE-B and UCE-B that's due this Sunday, so for the last unit. And because I was late on getting the comprehension exercise to you, then I extended the availability window on that one. So you haven't had at least a week, and I posted an announcement about that. But I should have put the B announcements up here as well. But then the C ones, the perusal one is out, so that's the reading assignment that in this case it's about squirrels and hoarding, and we'll talk about the kind of the scatter hoarding behavior of squirrels and other such animals and how that involves learning in Tuesday's lecture. But that's a paper about that I hope you'll find interesting. And then I'm working on this assignment, which I should be able to get to you pretty quickly because I was able to get all of the learning outcomes for the three lectures done ahead of time. So I should be able to put in that assignment even if I don't have all the lectures done yet for the unit. So that's kind of the announcement going forward. So let's just start things off with sorry, I should have reminded you, said, let's start, we'll have an iClicker exercise to start things off, and let's make this be it here. So I'll go ahead and start the poll. I have so much trouble finding the mouse. There it is. All right, so question here is, if I were to ask the causal question, how are memories stored? Then my question, going from Timmergen's perspective here, what type of causal question is this? Is it A, mechanism, B, phylogeny, C, ontogeny, or D, function? Or in other words, is it asking for hypotheses about mechanism, phylogeny, ontogeny, or function? So go ahead and give that a shot. I'll see if I can connect to iClicker here so I don't have to go back and forth while you're doing that. A mobile app is so finicky. All right, well, I'll give up on that. Okay, so let's see where people are at. Looks like we got 70 responses. I'll give it another couple of seconds here. "72 responses, or I'll give you 10 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and stop. So interesting responses there. So there was 67% of the class was for mechanism, 4% for phylogeny, and then 15% and 14% respectively split between ontogeny and function. And that's interesting there. So most people were in mechanism, and that was the answer that I was looking for. This one, I think, would be a distractor for this one might be ontogeny, because it sort of seems like we're talking about memories developing over time. And I can understand that confusion, but in this case, we're saying like the particular mechanism of you just had a memory right now, not how does the brain develop? So how do I grow a brain? That's development. So how do neurons connect together during the process of development? That is a developmental question. But this to me is more of a mechanism question. It's not function because we're asking how. So we're not saying why are memories good. we're just saying, how. So we have no idea why memories are good at all. When we're not asserting anything about that, we're just looking for how does it work inside the brain or elsewhere. And then phylogeny, we're not asking any evolutionary questions about, who has a memory and who doesn't. Question. Well, I mean, I of course, there's no such thing as a gotcha question, so I wouldn't. I'm not trying to make you fail, so I would be as specific as I thought I could be without giving things away. But I mean, to me, this if and we'll talk about this today, but like with practice, this should immediately become obvious to you that it's a mechanism. With practice, right now it's murky, but that's just because it takes a while to learn this stuff. Learning isn't instantaneous, but like when we have our PhD students propose their 5 years of their research they're going to do, and they have to come up with basically at least three causal questions to study, then if this, if somebody said how are memories stored in a slime mold, then there would be no question that that would be a mechanism. They would be studying, we're going to take slime molds that are sitting on the table, and we are going to disrupt different physiological mechanisms in the slime mold and see under which disruption does the slime mold stop learning, and that will then test the mechanism of learning in that slime mold. And so this to me, I think it might be a little murky, but but I think it has a very clear answer. So I think it's only murky because we just haven't gotten to the end of the class yet. But it is my hope that if we all do our jobs, my job and your job, that by the end of class, if I were to ask this on a final exam, then we would get 95%, for mechanism. So if you're not seeing mechanism yet, that's totally fine. These things take time. But to me, this is a very clear question. Yeah. Yeah. So mechanism is the most proximate. It is the most connected to what's going on at this instant. Function is the most ultimate. It is the least connected to what's going on now and more connected to why it's maintained in the population. Um, Ontogeny is the next proximate one up. So how did we get here? So over my life history. And then phylogeny is the one that's under function. So it is sort of the second most ultimate. How did this behavior get here over evolutionary history? So it started out as a behavior for foraging, and then it turned into a behavior for self-defense or something like that. If we're going from most proximate to most ultimate mechanism, and then that's most proximate, what's the next most proximate? Ontogeny. What's the next? Phylogeny. And then what's left over? Function. Okay. Any other questions about this? All right. For fun, since we just did that, and I think I just gave away the answer to this next one, let's do one more iClicker. So go advance here. So this is the new one. And so now if I ask the question, why do animals learn? Why do we have memory? Why do we learn? Then what type of causal question is this? Same choices: A, mechanism; B, phylogeny; C, ontogeny; D, function. And so now we're looking for a tip here, is that the why animals learn, we're asking about a benefit, benefits and costs. And whenever we hear benefits and costs, there's only one of these that our mind should go to. So, all right, let's see. I got 59 responses. So let's give it a few more seconds, maybe 65 responses. We'll give it 10 more seconds. 68 responses. I think we had a few more. I think we had like 71 at the last one. So let's get them in. I'm about to hit stop. All right, stop. So here, there was more agreement in the class. So 1% A, mechanism, 2%, sorry, 3% B, phylogeny, 6% C, ontogeny, and 90% D, function. And that was the one I was looking for, function. So otherwise known as adaptation. So whenever you see Y, whenever you see how, you should think probably ontogeny or mechanism. Whenever you see Y, probably phylogeny or function. And in this case, because it's asking about cost and benefits, it's not asking about evolutionarily, where did it come from? Like, where did it evolve from? Then we're down here at function. So costs and benefits are always function, otherwise known as adaptation. So any questions about that? All right, great. So focus back on the slides here. Okay. All right, so why do animals learn? It's a function that, or a question we can think about, a functional question. So when we talk about why questions like these, where there's obvious benefits and costs that we're asking about, then those are at the ultimate level. Now, this seems to be referring more to benefits, but if I would have asked you about costs, like if I would say, if I'd ask you a question about how costly a particular behavior was, that also would be about function, because what you're saying there is if it's more costly for one trait than another, then the extra costs on that trait will cause it to have a selective disadvantage. So the why questions are what gives things selective advantages or disadvantages that will change their frequency in the population. So it's with benefits and costs in these questions. Now, how do we calculate the benefits and costs for any particular behavior? Well, those benefits in part come from the environment or the ecology. So I can say for this particular habitat, learning is beneficial, because if I learn that there are certain colors that are associated with certain rewards, and I always go to those colors first, then I will have a greater return rate on those rewards than others that just have to search and aren't paying attention to the colors. So that's an example where the environment modulates the benefits, but can also modulate the cost. So there might be certain costs to learning that are higher in some environments than the others. Now, there are other questions we can ask. How are memories stored? So that's mechanistic. That is a separate question. It lives at a different level of explanation. But once we answer that question, once we assert there is a mechanism, a neuron, and it stores a memory this particular way, that can actually inform other aspects of hypotheses at other levels of explanation. Because here I was talking about costs due to the environment, but it may be that different ways you store memory in the head have different metabolic costs. And so knowing the mechanism can actually give us insight into potential answers to other questions. So getting back to the murkiness question, like we never want to confound proximate and ultimate. And so, if sometimes you can have an explanation for an animal behavior. So, you can say that an octopus carries a coconut around, and periodically will climb into the coconut for protection. And you could say that the octopus is planning ahead, bringing that coconut around because the octopus knows that eventually it's going to need shelter. And so the octopus is forecasting forward. You could alternatively say that the octopus just has this trait where it has this affinity for coconut shells, and it just carries a coconut shell with it. And if you happen to be carrying a coconut shell, if you get into a hairy situation where you need protection, the one's right there. So you can very quickly protect yourself. That doesn't require the octopus to be planning ahead. So we could say ultimately the reason why it's good for an octopus to carry a coconut around with it is that it's beneficial because it can provide protection. That's the reason why octopi that carried coconut shells outperformed octopi that didn't. But the proximate mechanism has to do with an attraction to a brown color, something about how it grips. It's all these how questions of how it finds the coconut and picks it up and holds on to it. So that's what I mean. We have to be careful not to confound proximate and ultimate by saying that the octopus is driven to plan for some future event. It might, but it also might not. So we have to be careful not to confound proximate and ultimate. But when we start answering proximate questions, they can inform future potential answers to ultimate questions. So, once we know that the vertebrate eye has a blind spot, that potentially introduces a cost that for certain types of objects, it might be difficult for vertebrates to see them. And so in certain habitats, that blind spot will be more costly than others. So that's what I mean by you can get intermixing between the levels without confounding the levels. Now, there's another question I could ask. How does learning develop? That fits into ontogeny, development. So that's, how does the brain grow, for example? Are there certain things that happen that make learning only possible during certain stages of development? I can ask things about, do larvae, in a holometabolous insect, an insect that goes through metamorphosis, then are there things that it can only learn as a larvae that have huge effects later when it is a mature insect? And so knowing about the development of the learning process can also inform potential answers to other levels of explanation, like these, like our ultimate, our functional thing here as well. So, I want to be careful that we don't confound explanations and mix explanations up. But once we have an explanation at one level, we can definitely enhance the way we answer questions at other levels. And I hope that will become clear as we start talking about the different ways that animals learn, the different mechanisms they use, and so on. Yeah. I would say that's a hard question. I would say it's easier to go to say, now that I know what the mechanism or development are, now I can start, like if I know that my eye looks like my dog's eye, I can now start asking phylogenetic questions about where we got that eye. So it's certainly easier to go kind of up. And like I was kind of mentioning in that funnel that I drew, where you got function at the top and evolutionary constraints and then developmental constraints limit the types of mechanisms you have. I think that's what makes it easier to say, once you answer questions at a lower level, to start then proposing new answers at higher levels. I don't want to say it's impossible to go the other way around. That there you could say, like hypothetically, it might be beneficial if I had the ability to see a different color or something like that. And then that might encourage how I look for a mechanism. But usually we look for mechanisms after we've established that the function already exists. Because it's like, wow, that insect can detect protein and carbohydrates with its feet. Well, how is it doing that? Let's look for the receptors in the feet that can detect protein and carbohydrates. So I don't want to say it's never possible to go down, but it's certainly easier to go up. Any other questions? All right, great. So learning. So that's what we're learning about now. There's going to be some examples and definitions. This is the next two lectures will be much more exciting. There'll be videos, there'll be strange behaviors. We'll have a little bit of that here, but unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of terminology, just so we have the frameworks and so on. So what is learning? Well, learning is a change in behavior as a result of experience. We sometimes refer to this as plasticity or neuroplasticity. Where do we get that term plasticity? Well, it comes from, a plastic deformation in a material is a material that after it gets pushed upon, it holds that shape. It doesn't return to its old shape. So we can contrast learning with innate or instinctive behaviors, where in those cases, if there's an environmental stimulus, then it might release a behavior in the animal. But once the stimulus goes away, maybe the behavior goes away. And so in that case, it's like an elastic deformation in the animal. It's like you've pushed on the rubber band that is the animal and it's responded in the right way. But then once the stimulus goes away, it just goes back to its old shape. So that's what we mean by plastic versus elastic. And so we often use that term, there is plasticity in the animal, or neuroplasticity, specifically when we're talking about, learning. And so learned behaviors change over life history, whereas innate behaviors change over evolutionary history. So some people, talk about like evolutionary learning, like as you go through different environments, there are certain regular signals that end up kind of casting a shadow on the evolutionary history of different evolved organisms, and you can think there of it sort of like learning over evolutionary time, but the actual animal is not learning, versus learning where you're actually making changes in the animal as a response to its past experience. And so we often characterize these with learning curves. So this is a generic learning curve here, where the idea here is we have some measure of performance and we give an opportunity for the animal to learn, let's say an association, and we'll talk more in detail about this in a bit, but an association between a stimulus and a desired response. So we want the animal to know that whenever you see blue, then we want the animal to bark, for example. So you show the animal blue, and then it doesn't bark. Well, okay, that's a low score. But over time, maybe every time you show the animal blue, if it barks, maybe you have some way of reinforcing that behavior. Again, terms we'll get to in a second. And then it barks more often when it sees blue. And then over time, so now if you know that you're giving it, this reinforcement for this particular behavior, then over time, eventually it learns this, that every time it, like if it was 100% of the time it sees blue, it barks. Well, the best we might be able to do is 75% of the time it sees blue, it barks, and it just flattens out. So for different animals and different stimuli and different behaviors, we characterize different learning curves. And sometimes you hear about this steep learning curve. And the weird thing about learning curves is a steep learning curve, like one that rises quickly, actually usually means it's easier to learn, or it takes less trials to learn. So saying that, that has a steep learning curve, sometimes it isn't used in necessarily the most appropriate way. But when people talk about learning curves, that's what they're talking about, is this trade-off between, or just the cost you have to put into it. It takes time to learn things. It took a lot of time for me to learn Timmergans 4 and to be able to classify that to the point where I feel confident enough to sit in a comprehensive exam and then ask the graduate students about these things. That was, I didn't pop out and I was able to do that. It took me a lot of time. And that likewise, this is why we study, this is why we practice. And this is why it just takes time to learn things, because our mechanisms limit us in how quickly we can learn. All right, now, so examples of that. So this is a honeybee example. This is what is known as proboscis extension reflex, PER assays. So the idea here is you take a honeybee, or there's lots of other insects you can do this with, flies and all that, and you put them in a soda straw, like this thing here, and you put a little duct tape over their head, and then they're kind of stuck in there. And then don't worry about this CSUS stuff, that will come later. But then the idea there is that the bee will, under certain conditions, when its antennae experience certain stimuli, it, as a reflex, will stick out its tongue. And this, potentially is adaptive. Why? Because, when it lands on a flower, if suddenly there are, nice sugary things on that flower, then it can then start slurping up the flower. So Likewise, you put that bee in the soda straw and you harness it there, you bring the flower to the bee and it sticks out its tongue. And so this fixed action pattern here. So here's an array of bees that are in these soda straws here, and there's somebody here at ASU, Brian Smith, who wrote this paper when he was at Ohio State. But this is a picture from Martin Jerfa's lab over here, he's in Europe. But a lot of people do this, and there's a guy here at ASU who does this. And if you take our research methods course, then you have an opportunity to try this research method too. I think Anushka did PER experiments, right? When you were, yeah. So very common research method in animal behavior because honeybees are a super common model organism for studying learning. It's like honeybees, mice, humans, you know. So this is a cartoon of that. So the idea here is you can give an odor without a sugar reward, or you can give an odor with a sugar reward. And over time, and we'll talk about all the details of this, you can get the bee to learn that certain odors that did not trigger the PER will start triggering the PER. And then you can study over here, how often did I have to reinforce this odor to get the bee to start sticking out its tongue in a consistent way. So initially on trial 1, the bee doesn't ever stick out the tongue, but after 5 trials or so, 100% of the time, it learns in like 5 trials, 100% of the time to stick out that. So that's pretty cool. There's other really cool stuff that I wish we had time to talk about. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And so why would you do that? Well, and I won't go into this particular paper too much, but I just put 2 learning curves next to each other because then the common thing you do is you have a baseline learning curve, and then you're testing a hypothesis about, let's say, what pathways in the brain are used in learning. So then you can condition the bee. You have another group of bees where you've manipulated them in a way that if that pathway in the brain was important in learning, it would affect that pathway, break that pathway down, and then you can study how that affects their learning curve. So again, I'm not going to go into details in this paper, but you can see this learning curve down here is slower than these other 2 learning curves. And so that's an example where the learning curve itself isn't the interesting thing, but the changes in learning curve from control group to treatment group are potentially the interesting thing. So that's fun there. But yeah, bees are really cool. They can learn really fast. And what's really neat is they have this thing called the antennal lobe, which is kind of like the olfactory bulb in your brain. And you can stain it with this dye that whenever calcium ions, which are important in kind of neurophysiology, start activating, then the dye actually lights up. And with the right type of microscope, you can actually watch it light up. And so you can, as the bee sniffs an odor, you can watch the part of their brain turn on in a pattern, and that pattern will be specific to the odor. And so you can actually train a machine learning algorithm to say, oh, that pattern, that is heptanol, or that pattern, that is octanol, and so on and so forth. Now, what's really cool is that there is plasticity in the antennal lobe. So if you say that neither of those things, heptanol or octanol, were rewarded, but now you reward one of them with sugar, and only after like 5 trials or something like that, and then you look at the patterns that are changed, and it turns out that the bee's antennal lobe will change the way it codes for the odors it's smelling. And if the odor that it smells has more than 50% of this rewarded odorant that is never associated with an odor before, it will light up the pattern for another already rewarded odorant. So it changes the representation in the antennal lobe so that the rest of the bee brain, which are like these mushroom bodies, that's kind of like my gray matter, or their mushroom, will sense the rewarded thing instead. So they have plasticity, like it's not up in their gray matter, it's down in their olfactory bulb. That's where they learn these little things. Now, the crazy thing is people like Martin Jerfa over here, there's a neuron that connects the antennal lobe to their mushroom bodies. And you can basically manipulate it in a certain way so that when you turn on light, that neuron goes away. And when you turn off light, so you have to kind of focus a laser on their brain in certain ways, you can get the basically to program it to go on and off. And so you can basically make it so that sometimes the bee has access to both their antennal lobe and their mushroom bodies, or sometimes just their antennal lobe. And when they only have access to their antennal lobe, they can learn odors. They can learn, very simple things like that. And in his case, he did with vision, so they can learn colors. But when you give them access to their mushroom body, they can learn concepts. So you can actually train a bee that above is a good thing. So whenever the square is above something else, anything else, then that's rewarded. Whenever the circle is below something else, whenever you see the same symbol, so you can train bees on a bunch of symbols, only reward them when the symbols are the same. And then you show them a bunch of symbols they've never seen before, and they will look for the ones that are the same. But they only can do that if that connection to the mushroom body is there. So you get higher learning in some parts of the brain and sort of more rudimentary learning in other parts of the brain. So a lot of really cool stuff you can do with bees, which is why they become such a nice model for studying learning. You don't need to know all that. It's just giving you examples of like why bee brains are cool. But this is what you're hoping to get out of this is what a real learning curve looks like. And it doesn't look too different than this kind of one here. And it's pretty cool that the bee goes up to like almost 100%. So any questions on learning curves? Yeah. Yeah, well, it's like the bee would never stick out her tongue when she smelled a particular odor, but then after this manipulation, then later she actually continues to stick out her tongue when you get that odor. So it's a plastic deformation. It's not like whenever she bumps into a wall, she turns left and then she goes back along her way. That's she didn't learn anything there. She just responded to the stimuli. Here, she actually is learning a new response to a stimuli that she didn't respond to before. Yeah. Oh, great question. So I would say, like here, different individuals can have different learning curves. So we could study my learning curve, your learning curve, and so on. And then if we wanted to study differences in learning across ecotypes, across species, we would maybe aggregate those, and we'd say that it seems like this species or this ecotype has an easier time learning this type of thing, whereas this one doesn't. So it might be that would sort of suggest that maybe this ecotype, it was important for them to evolve the ability to learn that association, but this other ecotype, it wasn't. And so they don't have that ability. That's a great question. And really, I think what you're getting at is like, can we characterize some broader notion of intelligence in the animals? And people are definitely trying to do that and to try, and it's inconclusive the kind of the things you can say, but there are some interesting general properties that you see. For one, that you see as you scale animals down across different species, their brains shrink, but so do like the things that their brains are connected to. So you could say, oh, the bee's got a tiny brain, but it's not really, does the bee have a tiny brain? How big is the bee's brain relative to its body? Because if it's got a lot more muscles to innervate or a lot fewer muscles to innervate, then it can have a smaller brain and still have the same capacity. So there are these curves where you look at the mass of the individual on one axis and the number of neurons on this axis, and it turns out it follows this three-fourth scaling law where it's kind of like you need fewer neurons per body mass as you get larger and larger and larger. And people don't exactly know all those things why, but what's beautiful about it is like everything falls on that line. Primates are a little above that line, so they have a few more neurons per unit body mass than the rest. Humans are a little bit more above that, but still they're in the ballpark. So then, yeah, there's these questions of like, well, what does that mean, these deviations from that line. And yeah, it's down a rabbit hole. But absolutely, you can understand why that would be like a really important question that a lot of people are thinking about and trying to answer. But we have to answer them B by B. So it's our learning curve in science is often very, very slow, very shallow. Any other questions? All right, so we got learning curves. We also have forgetting curves. Similar idea. So if we've provided the bee a rewarded stimulus, now let's provide her the stimulus without reward over and over and over again and see how long it takes for her to stop sticking out her tongue. So that's the forgetting curve. And so this, there's natural forgetting that happens in animals. And so if you want really long-lasting memories, then often you need periodic reinforcement to maintain those memories to prevent them from being. And so it doesn't mean that every time you get that cue, it has to be rewarded. But if it doesn't get rewarded once in every 100 times, then there may not be any hope for that memory to lasting. So again, it's natural. So it's then, we want to then ask, how quickly do different animals forget different things? And so, there's also, an extinction curve. It's related. Extinction curves look just like these, but we apply them to a behavior that we're trying to suppress. So a forgetting curve is, we've trained them on something and we just want to see how long, how quickly until they naturally forget it. A extinction curve is we're actually reinforcing them in a way